Hello readers by eyes and by ears, this is Mari Chan and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we are continuing with the reading of Stars of Chaos Volume 5, also known as Sha Po Lang, and as Disabled Tyrant's beloved pet fish is the focus for today, we're only doing just 2 short chapters of this, and that's going to be the 4th and 5th extras, so I hope you enjoy. On romance. Compared to his predecessor, the late long-gone Emperor Li Feng, it could be said that Li Min had a better grasp on the pace of political change as a ruler. The reforms he implemented came wave after thunderous wave, but all were handled in an orderly manner. Decrees were followed by policies, which were gradually implemented first among the upper echelons of society before trickling steadily down to the common folk. He opened new schools to educate the masses and sent dragon warships on long voyages overseas to escort merchant vessels and talented scholars seeking an education abroad, quietly disentangling sovereign powers that had been centralized since the days of Emperor Wu from the convoluted snarl of the imperial court. But though Li Min was diligent in governance and never ostentatious, he did not follow the lead of his elder brother in denying himself comfort. Every year, when the weather grew hot, it was his habit to lead the ministers of the court to the reconstructed Sunlight Palace to escape the heat. Likewise, nothing could stop His Majesty from ending every New Year's banquet early and running off to the hot spring villa in the north outskirts to soak in peace. But in the first year of Taishu, the ministers of the court had yet to acclimate to the new emperor's personal habits. There were therefore several instances in which His Majesty was disturbed during his sacred hot spring getaway. The most irritating and persistent of these disturbances was Shen Yi. On the 5th day of the first month in the first year of His Majesty's reign, Shen Yi escorted the war reparations back to the capital and reported on the particulars of his mission. Assuming Gu Yuan and Chang'e had by now had their fill of necking, and that he wouldn't be egregiously out of turn in paying them a New Year's visit, he picked up several jars of his dad's personal vintage and headed off for the northern outskirts. Old Master Shen had little to fill his days with at home and spent the majority of his time tinkering with this and that. On one occasion, he made too much wine and, with no place to store it, consigned the excess to Southward Tower to be sold. To everyone's astonishment, the 2 giant cartloads of moonshine sold out in 3 days. Old Master Shen's personal vintage became so popular it was well nigh impossible to procure a single drop. When the old man heard, it went to his head. He refused to mass-produce his wine, making only 2 or 3 jars per batch, which he gifted to friends and family. In his idle moments, he convinced scholars to write stories in the local papers about his wine-making escapades, going out of his way to ensure everyone knew about this rare and unattainable wine. A despicable move, to be sure. In the end, even the simple little jars used to store the Shen family vintage became a coveted item in the capital. By the same token, old Master Shen's wine became a highly respectable gift, allowing the impoverished Shen Yi an easy way to deal in favors. Unfortunately, in this instance, the famous vintage passed only briefly through Gu Yuan's hands before it was ruthlessly confiscated by His Majesty. "I'll have someone warm this up for you," Chang'e said, gently but firmly tugging the wine jar away. Taking in Gu Yuan's aggrieved expression, Shen Yi was perplexed. He elbowed him once Chang'e was gone. "What business do you have pulling a long face when the sovereign of our nation takes such good care of you?" Gu Yuan looked as if his stomach ached. He slanted a glance at Shen Yi, then waved a listless hand. "The hell do you know?" Shen Yi had gathered himself to return fire when he remembered he came to seek Gu Yuan's advice. It wouldn't do to offend him before asking, so he checked his temper and lowered his voice. "Zishi, there's something I want to ask you about." "Speak," Gu Yuan muttered. Shen Yi's throat worked, his expression turning deadly earnest. "I want to propose to Miss Chun, but I worry I'll seem too presumptuous." Gu Yuan's eyebrows shot toward his hairline. "Presumptuous? What do you mean, presumptuous?" Shen Yi went mute. "You've already given her a token of affection, haven't you?" Gu Yuan continued, baffled. Hanging his head, Shen Yi rummaged through his pockets and pulled out a tiny cloth pouch wrapped in a length of silk. As Gu Yuan looked on in astonishment, he unwound the tight parcel to reveal the contents hidden beneath a full 3 layers of silk, that hair ornament of legend. "You still haven't given this to her?" Guyuan gave his ruthless evaluation. Well, thank goodness for that. It's hideous. Shen Yi clutched at his heart in silence. Guyuan continued his scathing appraisal. Agonizing over your decision for so long only to choose such a dowdy old thing. Honestly, anyone who doesn't know better would think it's an offering for your mother. Besides, it's obvious Miss Chun doesn't prefer cumbersome stuff like pearls and jade. A pointless purchase. While Shen Yi could just barely humble himself to accept the first half of Guyuan's spiel, the second half gave him pause. How do you know what she prefers? He asked, wary. Guyuan beckoned him closer. Unless she is truly too poor to afford it, a woman will most certainly buy what she likes herself, Guyuan said with perfect sincerity. Don't tell me you think she would agonize over something like this all day with the expectation that someone, someday, might read her mind and buy it for her? Leaning back, Guyuan regarded him with pity. You're totally overthinking this. He sighed, shaking his head. Shen Yi could muster no response. Generally, Guyuan took great pleasure in bullying Shen Yi, but seeing his timid demeanor now, he felt a rare pang of sympathy. He picked up a hot spring egg from a tray at his side and cracked it open, offering the morsel to Shen Yi. Thinking back on it, Guyuan realized Shen Yi and Miss Chun had gone their separate ways after offing Jialai Yinghua. Chen Qingshu had returned briefly to the Chun family estate before hurrying back to the capital to tend to Chang'an. Meanwhile, Shen Yi had remained on the northern border until Guyuan transferred him to Jiangnan. The pair had been sent to opposite ends of the earth and had only just managed to catch their breath in the last few months. It could be assumed they'd barely had the opportunity to speak to each other. Shen Yi, that useless idiot. He'd survived a brush with death with Chen Qingshu, then let his chance slip through his fingers. If not for Miss Chun's naturally standoffish demeanor, he could never have afforded to dither as long as he had. Torn between pity at Shen Yi's misfortune and exasperation at his cowardice, Guyuan offered up his earnest guidance. Even if you say it to yourself 100 times, it's all pointless if you don't tell her. Never mind whether she accepts you or not, you have to tell her how you feel first, right? I never know what to say when I see her, Shen Yi said in a pained voice. Guyuan cut straight to the point. Given how skilled you are at rambling at everyone else, there can only be one reason you don't know what to say to her. You're too focused on your objective. You feel you have ulterior motives and are afraid of overstepping, so you become overly cautious and lose your nerve. Shen Yi was never short of criticism when it came to Guyuan's own degeneracy. But in this moment, he couldn't help but nod, wholly convinced. Makes sense. You're approaching this entirely the wrong way, Guyuan continued with the confidence of ample experience. If you want to skillfully navigate the situation, you must first show no fear. Regard her as any other person. Don't worship her like Buddha. Talk to her as you would anyone else. Now, on the other hand, Miss Chun thinks of nothing but medicine year-round and has a mild temperament. In other words, she might be a little slow on the uptake. You must also ensure that she sees how you treat her differently from everyone else. It's a subtle thing. Do too little, and she'll never realize your feelings. Do too much, and you'll risk appearing vulgar. When Chang'an returned, he had swapped the large wine jar for a small bottle. He directed his attendants to bring out a portable stove to warm the wine before dismissing them again, then stood to the side, listening to Guyuan expound on the intricacies of romance with a faint smile. As for the two he watched, one was putting his all into showing off while the other was diligently studying the former's ways. Neither noticed His Majesty's return. Please teach me, Marshal, Shen Yi implored. This isn't something I can teach you. I've never encountered this problem myself, Guyuan said, all seriousness. See how handsome and confident I am? No matter what I do, girls never find me vulgar. Shen Yi stared. It doesn't matter how long you stare at me. It's no good, Guyuan said. Besides, this is something you must grasp intuitively. It can't be conveyed in words. There's no way you'll get it if I only tell you. Shen Yi stifled his sudden urge to beat this man to death and squeezed out. In that case, how about something more practical? Give me an example, for instance. Guyuan considered a moment. For instance, for a man like you, who's getting along in age. Excuse me? Shen Yi fumed. For a mature man like you. Mature, okay? Guyuan disdainfully corrected himself. Don't talk about love like some green lad. Women will think you're unreliable. When it comes to sweet nothings, quality is more important than quantity. Ideally, you should slip in a few tender words between 100 lines of serious talk. Touch her heart without seeming too frivolous. He was finally speaking like a person with sense. Shunyi nodded along. There is a trick to interspersing such lines throughout your speech, Guyuan continued. Before putting it into practice, prepare a mental outline. You have to deliver them calmly and without batting an eye, while making sure it sounds natural in the flow of conversation. When you're just getting started, it's best not to say anything too bold. Know where to stop and where to draw the line. Make sure she's amenable to your attention before discreetly pushing your luck when the opportunity arises. Eavesdropping from the sidelines, the emperor folded his arms and nodded along as well. He now had a decent idea of how Guyuan had used this method on him in the past. However, Guyuan went on, even if you're coy in your speech, you must be sure to please her in all other ways that matter. For instance, consider her feelings and look after her comfort at all times. Follow her pace and preferences, and choose your words and actions accordingly. For this, you must observe, preferably with your own eyes and not by asking her directly. This shows sincere interest. It's also important to look at her the right way. Shunyi dearly wished he could go grab a brush and paper, that he might write down the Marquis of Anding's gold precepts word for word. He hastened to ask, how should I look at her? He glanced up and met Guyuan's eyes. Usually, when Guyuan looked at him, his eyes seemed to say, out of the way, you're blocking my light. But at this moment, they seemed to say, you are my light. Guyuan's gaze carefully straddled the line between rapt attention and dreamy daze. The corners of his eyes curved gently with the promise of a smile. It was as if he had eyes for nothing but the one before him. Yet, at the same time, there was an irrepressible wildness to his gaze. His lashes fluttered, as if suddenly caught out, and he lowered his eyes, naturally affecting a slight awkwardness as he reached up to rub lightly at his nose with a grin. Shunyi nearly dropped his half-eaten egg on the ground. Chang'e couldn't bear to watch any longer. He strolled over, coughing loudly. Guyuan promptly lowered the leg he had propped up on the little side table and rearranged himself into the shape of a proper gentleman. Inexplicably self-conscious, Shunyi jumped to his feet. Your Majesty! Chang'e softened his fake smile into his customary gentle expression. No need for such courtesies in private, he said with a wave of his hand. Please sit, General Shen. Shunyi had the distinct impression it was time he made himself scarce. Chang'e smiled. I happened to overhear a few words just now. Did you come to ask after Miss Chen? This question only magnified Shunyi's discomfort. Actually, I heard Miss Chen has greatly admired General Shen since the battle on the northern border, Chang'e said to the crimson-faced Shunyi. He calmly set the little bottle of wine on the stove to warm it, slapping aside Guyuan's reaching hand without even looking. If your feelings are requited, there's no need for such careful probing. Just the other day, I found some rare medical texts in the palace. I was planning on sending someone to deliver them to Miss Chen. Perhaps General Shen would like to help me with this errand? Shunyi nearly fell to his knees before His Majesty. Chang'e's handful of words seemed far more valuable than Guyuan's long-witted speech. Within the time a stick of incense took to burn, Chang'e watched in satisfaction as Shunyi floated out the door. In truth, the one who most longed for Shunyi to hurry and find a wife was the emperor himself. If only so this man would stop hanging around Guyuan day and night. For as long as Chang'e had known them, the two had practically been joined at the hip. Guyuan might not tell Chang'e when he met with difficulties, but he always confided in Shunyi. And while there were several perfectly good reasons for this, it was impossible for Chang'e to be content with it. One problem dealt with, Chang'e turned to the other. Guyuan hastily shot back a sultry look. Chang'e quietly marked this offense down to be settled at a later date. So, even your glances are rehearsed in advance? As expected of an old hand like you, Tsushi. Batting his lashes, Guyuan stretched languidly before rising to his feet and sauntering over to Chang'e. Loosening the fastenings of his fox fur cloak, he pulled Chang'e in and wrapped the fur around the both of them. You could just say you're jealous, Your Majesty. He chuckled softly into Guyuan's ear. You're making a face like you've just drunk vinegar. Guyuan's heated murmur sent a tingle shivering down Changgang's neck, as expected of a man well versed in the 36 stratagems. He had taught Shunyi merely the bare basics. Guyuan sniffed at Changgang's temples and exclaimed, "Too sour. Your Majesty, let's make a deal. Seeing as you just gulped a whole vat of vinegar, won't you let me have a sip of wine?" Changgang laughed in anger. "You're dreaming. You can have a sniff." Dissatisfied, Guyuan clicked his tongue. "Last night you let me lick a chopstick's worth. Why do I only get a sniff today? It's all Shunyi's fault. That man's a walking calamity, coming here to make a nuisance of himself on a holiday." Changgang reached for a chopstick and dipped it in a cup of the warmed wine. "Go ahead then. Stop haggling." Guyuan blinked at him. The two of them regarded each other in silence for a moment, the aroma of wine rising from the chopstick held between them. Just as Changgang thought Guyuan would behave himself after all, he took the chopstick and sniffed it. Then, cupping Changgang's chin, he swiped the residual wine off the chopstick over Changgang's lips and, swift as a bolt from the blue, leaned in to lick them clean before tossing the Henderson chopstick aside. The dumbstruck Changgang hadn't time to react. He was thoroughly taken advantage of in one wine-scented motion. Wiping his mouth, Guyuan drew back with a small smile. "An excellent vintage. I'm drunk." The new emperor, a victim of this cruel and inventive new form of teasing, sat frozen for a beat. At last, he reached the end of his patience. Chasing after Guyuan, he suddenly felt it was of utmost importance that he personally check the progress of General Gu's physical recovery. Qingming after the rain. Changgang had declared to the public that, to avoid any hint of impropriety, he would not under any circumstances set foot in the imperial harem, which would remain under the empress's control. Luckily, Li Feng had never had a large harem, so it was manageable even for a sickly invalid like the Empress Dowager. Such a declaration was hardly necessary, as the emperor rarely spent his nights in the palace. As far back as anyone could remember, there had never been an emperor like this one, who clocked in at the palace in the morning only to leave the moment the court assembly drew to a close. At first, some stepped forward to decry such behavior as an affront to established protocol. The emperor's supporters took every last one of them to task. His Majesty had declared from the beginning that he was merely a regent. For all that he was only governing until the crown prince came of age, he was a diligent ruler who never crossed any lines. Why then were there so many bootlickers sowing chaos and urging him to usurp the throne? Led by Xuling, the imperial censorate became the emperor's great champion. In the name of setting aside the old and welcoming the new, the department spent its days examining the theoretical basis of the emperor's new policies and preparing supporting arguments for them when debates arose in court. When court business concluded, the emperor would occasionally make a show of returning to the Princian estate, which he transformed into a salon of sorts where he privately received members of the imperial court. At the end of the day, however, he went running off to the Marquis estate, not far away. That year, the first rains had come unseasonably early. The capital greeted the eve of the Qingming festival with a steady drizzle. Guyuan had yet to lay down his armor of good, but he could finally settle down in the capital long term. After so many years of feeling like a stranger in his own home, he ordered the overgrown Marquis estate properly renovated. The Marquis of Anding's estate, which had been on the verge of spawning several terrifying ghost stories, began to look lived in again at last. The ongoing renovations to the house and gardens inevitably dug up a number of fascinating old items from years past, and following Captain Huo around and picking through the lot soon became His Majesty's favored after-dinner recreation. "Did this belong to the eldest princess?" Changgang asked, pointing at a square box. Out of respect, he didn't touch it directly. The old maid who was cleaning the room smiled. Indeed, she had it specially made for the little Marquis. She opened it to show him. To his astonishment, the little box, which looked as if it should have held precious jewels, contained only an old feather duster. "The little Marquis was a terror as a child," the maid said. "He never took a scolding to heart, and if you shut him in his room to reflect on the error of his ways, he'd pick the lock. A slap on the palm or a spanking wouldn't do either. And, of course, the old master had an explosive temper. There eventually came a time when he wanted to discipline the little Marquis according to old family rules, and, well, you know what that would entail, Your Majesty. The old Marquis was heavy-handed. How could a child endure such a thing? The eldest princess feared what might happen. She recalled that she had once seen a village woman disciplining her son with a broom during a military expedition, and came up with this idea to deal with the little Marquis. Chang'e gingerly lifted Guyuan's feather duster from its residence with both hands. The thin rod that ran through the length of it would break if swung with too much force, thereby avoiding risk of death to its victim. The fluffy outer layer wasn't made of real pheasant feathers either, but seemed to be a blend of fine bamboo fibers and some sort of bristly fur woven together. To be beaten by something like this. He had grown up in the Marquis estate and at times seemed more the residence master than the master himself. The old maid referred to him as Your Majesty, but treated him with no fear or deference. She continued merrily. Our Marquis really was a menace in his youth. He got up to all kinds of trouble. Turn your back for an instant, and he was liable to climb the walls to tear down the roof. He got so out of hand. The only thing he ever feared was this feather duster. Only mention the word, and he'd immediately behave himself. Guyuan always maintained the image of the capable elder with Chang'e. His childhood years were a complete blank to the young emperor, and he listened with great interest. The funniest thing was when the princess tried to beat him. He'd run all over the courtyard, screaming his head off. The way he wailed, you'd think he was actually crying. Actually crying? Chang'e blinked in surprise. Don't tell me he was pretending. Of course he was, the old maid sighed as she walked along. Short of a real walloping, you'd never catch the little Marquis of ours shedding real tears. He'd run around the courtyard bawling like crashes of thunder with no rain, and all the things he'd say, one pitiful line after another, treating his mother to woeful pleas like, Mom, don't you love me? Don't you want me anymore? Aren't I your own flesh and blood? And, Mom, are you going to replace me with a more obedient younger brother? I've mended my ways. Please don't toss me out. I only have one mom, even if you don't love me anymore. I'll be a feral child, unloved and abandoned to the wilderness. Just listening made one's heart waver. The princess could never bear to truly lay a hand on him. Chang'e was laughing so hard he began to wheeze as he pictured the scene. As expected of a master of military strategy, of course Guyuan understood the concepts of the best lies contain a kernel of truth and strike first at the heart, even as a child. The wrinkles fanning from the old maid's eyes creased in a smile, but when she next spoke, the tone of her voice had shifted. Later on, he went to the border. When he came back, everything had changed. Chang'e's smile faded. The old maid went on, lost in memory. He used to lock himself in his room every day, wouldn't respond to anyone, wouldn't cry. The meals brought to his room would be pushed back out exactly as they arrived. He would speak no matter who tried to comfort him and refused to go out. He'd always been like a pesky monkey, but he returned from the border like a ghost, completely transformed. A few months later, when the old Marquis finished settling things in the north and returned to the estate, perhaps it's not my place to say, but the old Marquis was very hard on the boy. I suppose he feared his son would really end up crippled and helpless. What happened? Chang'e asked softly. The old Marquis kicked down his door and dragged him from his room. The boy's eyes had suffered such a terrible injury. How could it not hurt to be suddenly exposed to sunlight? He stumbled along, weeping the whole way. This time the tears were real, but he didn't say a word. The old maid pointed. That little pond over there. The old Marquis lashed his horsewhip around the boy's throat, shoved him out over the water so he could see his reflection, and yelled directly into his ears. Look at yourself. Are you a member of the Gu family or not? Chang'e followed her pointing finger. The old pond had dried up after years of neglect and only recently been refilled with fresh water. A handful of fish swam in it now, leisurely flipping their fins. The little Marquis's throat was caught in the whip, but he still shouted back, I can't see! Listening to her speak, Chang'e felt he had been transported back in time to hear those words with his own ears. His hand spasmed around the feather duster. The old Marquis shoved his son's head under the water. He said, "If you can't see, then stay down there until you can. Either get on your feet or go find a rafter to hang yourself. The Gu family would rather end its bloodline than keep trash among its ranks." Here the old maid shook her head. "It's been so many years, but this old woman still remembers every word. He really was far too harsh." For a span, neither said a word. Then Chang'eng asked, voice soft, "The old Marquis could stand to treat him like that?" It's natural for a parent to feel distress for their child. Aside from hardening his heart to temper his son, what other options did he have? There's something the old Marquis once said. The only way to heal shattered bone is to hammer in iron nails to hold the pieces in place. The more painful the little Marquis's circumstances, the more imperative it was to deny him any crutch. The moment he leaned on one, he'd never stand up again under his own power, the old maid said. If the old Marquis hadn't treated his son so harshly, who could have legitimately reassembled this scattered Black Iron Battalion all those years ago? Without the Black Iron Battalion, the far Westerners would likely never have had the opportunity to sail all this way across the sea and make their own attempt at conquest. By the time they came, Great Liang would have long been swallowed up, one bite at a time, by foreign adversaries during the first revolt in the western regions. Without an army to defend them, how long would the decrepit aristocrats living in the luxury of the capital have been able to hold onto their noble titles and maintain their lavish lifestyles? During the bitter winter months, we servants were forbidden from providing the little Marquis warm cotton-padded clothing. The child's hands and feet were nearly blue from cold when he trained, and when he returned to his room, he could barely pick up a bowl. A dozen iron puppets would surround him as he trained all day while the old Marquis watched. We thought that man wouldn't even blink if his son up and died before his eyes. A few years later, the old Marquis followed the eldest princess into the next life, and His Majesty, the Yuanhe Emperor, took the little Marquis into the palace. The sound of a bird squawking from around the corner made the old maid pause, and the two of them looked up to see Gu Yuan sauntering toward them with a cage in hand. The luckless Mina, formerly of the Shun residence, had grown dizzy with the cage's malicious shaking. Speechless with fury, it could only raise its voice and scream bloody murder. Since being temporarily relieved of his duties and finding himself with free time to deal with this bird, Gu Yuan had never once lost the advantage in the human-avian war. Having claimed his victory, he was presently taking the creature on a walk to revel in his triumph. He was brought up short when he saw what Chang'eng was holding, and his eyes narrowed as his expression turned overcast. Dashing over, Gu Yuan grabbed the feather duster. "What nonsense have you dug out of storage? Haven't you anything better to do?" Even when a chronic illness was deemed cured, there were inevitably lingering symptoms. For instance, Gu Yuan would likely never fully recover his sight and hearing. Likewise, although Chang'eng had freed himself from the nightmares that had plagued him most of his life, he was beset by strange dreams when he was particularly exhausted or had too much on his mind. That night, perhaps because he was still thinking about the feather duster Gu Yuan had snatched away, Chang'eng had an odd dream. He dreamed he walked into the Marquis estate, but it was nothing like the bleak and desolate Marquis estate he knew. Instead, it was bustling with people and seemed very lively. Distantly, Chang'eng heard the grind of metal on metal. He followed the sound and soon arrived at a clearing in a rear courtyard, where a group of ferocious-looking iron puppets were attacking a little boy from all sides. The boy's eyes were covered with a strip of black cloth wide enough to obscure half his face as he struggled to dodge the puppet's assault. As Chang'eng watched, one of the puppets behind him lunged forward. The automaton had swapped its sword for an iron rod, which whistled toward the boy in a wide arc. Sensing the malicious wind, the little boy instinctively shifted to evade the strike. "Stop! That won't work!" Chang'eng suddenly remembered the advice he'd been given years ago. "Your mind is agitated, so your footwork is unstable. No matter how powerful the sword technique, if your legs lack stability, then you'll be like a river without a source or a tree without roots. You'll have no foundation on which to build your attack. It's human nature to cower away in fear, but doing so makes it difficult to quickly think up a counterattack. You'll just get flustered and end up getting caught by your enemy instead." The moment the boy hesitated and shrank back, the puppet was on top of him. With a loud crack, the iron monster's staff struck that slender back, sending the boy flying as the seams of his outer robe burst open to reveal the protective armor beneath. Chang'eng rushed over, helping the dust-covered boy up from the ground. At the same time, he reached back to draw his own sword, disabling the iron puppets still relentlessly pursuing the child. Chang'eng tossed his blade aside and reached for the boy's blindfold with shaking hands. Before he could remove it, he heard the sound of footsteps approaching. Chang'eng whirled around to see a middle-aged man ambling over with his hands clasped behind his back. Dressed in casual robes, he had a handsome face and the elegant demeanor of a scholar. But as his eyes came into view, Chang'eng saw that they were viciously sharp, gleaming with the blades of 1,000-strong army. Though Chang'eng had never met this man, he recognized him on sight. The adult Guyuan bore little resemblance to him. Their facial features were nothing alike, yet father and son were remarkably similar in bearing, evidence of their shared blood. The man's steps slowed to a stop as he turned to Chang'eng. "Even if you take him away, you don't have what it takes to raise him. And even if you do manage to raise him, he'll topple before the gentlest of storms." Chang'eng carefully held that skinny little boy to his chest. "He can lean on me." The late Marquis shook his head. Chang'eng heard the roar of gold tanks from behind him. Lifting the boy, he danced aside as the troop of iron puppets he had disabled reawakened and moved to surround them. The automatons advanced in an orderly fashion, seeming to multiply as they marched until Chang'eng faced an army of iron-wrought heavy armor. The faint sound of a night watchman's clapper echoed in the distance as the battalion of puppets arrayed themselves, turning predatory eyes on Chang'eng as they swarmed forward. Chang'eng held little Guyuan and ran until he was gasping for breath. He wanted to shout at that indifferent old man watching from the side. "I saved the nation on the brink of destruction from the late emperor's ineptitude. What makes you think I can't protect Guyuan?" But in the dream, his voice stuck in his throat. In his frenzied dash, he missed a step. Heart pounding, he groped out frantically and felt a firm hand grab his own. His eyes flew open. The gas lamps in the room were already lit, the sky still dark beyond the window. Guyuan's hand was clasped tightly around his own. "You didn't wake when I called out to you." Guyuan felt his forehead. "Are you feeling sick?" Chang'eng stared at him blankly. "I had a dream," he said at last. Guyuan was alarmed. It wasn't a nightmare from the Wu'erge. Turning onto his side, Chang'eng clutched Guyuan's arm to his chest and pressed his forehead against Guyuan's elbow. "I dreamed I stole you away from the old Marquis, and your dad sent a whole battalion of iron puppets to kill me," he confessed quietly. After a beat of startled silence, Guyuan burst into peals of carefree laughter. With a light tug, he pulled the emperor, who was trying to have a lie-in, out from beneath the blankets and extricated his arm. "How brave of you, your majesty. I'll have you know the old man has 100,000 spectral soldiers at his disposal. But all right, enough of that. It's time you got up. There's a grand assembly today. Oh, it's also the Qingming festival. Perhaps the old man's run out of spirit money in the afterlife and came specially to remind us of the occasion." Chang'eng watched him dress from where he sat on the bed, savoring every detail. Only when Guyuan finished smoothing his robes under the glow of the lamps did he reluctantly avert his eyes. "Why would your dad come to me instead of you if he needs money?" "You're easier to bully, obviously," Guyuan said with a laugh. But after a moment, his smile took on a touch of melancholy. "I don't owe him a thing. I suppose he's too embarrassed to come see me." That day, Chang'eng cleared half his day's schedule to accompany Guyuan as he swept the tombs of his ancestors. Standing before his family's ancestral tablets, Guyuan was like a monk who had taken a vow of silence. He spoke not a word as he went through the motions of burning the paper money. When he had finished, he stepped to the side and stood in cold indifference. His parents lying beneath the yellow springs knew what he had been up to the past few years, so there was no need for him to elaborate. Chang'eng, on the other hand, conscientiously lit some incense and offered a libation of wine. It was difficult to speak with Guyuan standing right there, so he said quietly in his heart, "I'll take good care of him, so don't worry. Please don't hammer any more iron nails into his body." "Let's go." Guyuan was tugging at his arm. Woken from his thoughts, Chang'eng made to follow him out when Guyuan turned back toward the eldest princess's memorial tablet. Keep an eye on your husband. Unless something urgent comes up, tell him to stay put down there and stop harassing my man. At these disgraceful words, Huodan, who had escorted them there, nearly fell to his knees and dashed his brains out right there before the old marquis. Guyuan sniffed huffily, then turned around and pulled Chang'eng away. His words were unexpectedly effective. After that day, Chang'eng never again dreamed of old Marquis Gu, nor his army of iron puppets. Still, that wasn't to say he went quietly. Rather than visit Chang'eng's dreams, the old marquis visited Gu Yuan's instead. But that, as they say, is a tale for another time. Alrighty, everyone, that concludes the reading of the 4th and 5th extras. I hope you all enjoyed them. Please let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, and I will see you all the next time. Well, Einiman.